Here I am, Andrew Gibbons, and today I have Lauren Botha with me. Now, Lauren is someone who has expertise, I shall build you up in this way, Lauren, and interest in critical reflection. And I won't say no more about that at this very moment. I'll throw it over to you, Lauren, to say what you feel we need to know about you and start us off on what you actually mean by critical reflection.
Yeah, well, it's really nice to be on with you today, Andrew. Well, for myself, I've been in a coaching and mentoring type profession since about 2003, 2004 onwards, where I've worked in a variety of different roles, but in all of them, I've somehow managed to do some coaching or some mentoring, which obviously I enjoy quite a lot because it's just something that naturally appeals to my type of personality. I've also worked on some government programs in Botswana where we had about 4,000 plus students that went through our programs every year. So I think from looking at an educational point of view, I think I've got quite a lot of experience as far as reflective practice and that's concerned. And then just more recently here, living in the UK, obviously, I've gone a little bit deeper into it where I've actually done a bachelor degree in coaching and mentoring, and obviously critical reflective practice or thinking is quite a big part of that. Looking at what it is and how it works and why it's important and all the formalities that go along with it.
Sure.
You know, and often I think when we've been talking before as well, we've, sort of mentioned what we think reflective thinking is or reflective learning or what practice it is in that sense. And it possibly means quite something different to each and every person, because some people might find it to be quite fleeting, kind of think, oh, well, that was a nice experience, or I didn't really like that, or something like that, whereas, when you're thinking about it critically, it's more on purpose. You're doing it deliberately with a definite action and cycle involved. And obviously that also, depending on your profession, could depend what route you take on how deeply you want to think about things and, sort of how you want to record that. So it kind of, I think it depends quite strongly from individual to individual how they feel they would take this up as a practice. For myself personally, I found that I've got better at it the more I do it. And I tend to use journals, and that I think you also mentioned that you quite like journaling.
Well, I wouldn't say I like it. I've been doing it for 33 years. Whether I like it or not is another thing, but I've been doing it a long time.
Oh, it's true. A person, sometimes you do something because it helps you in some way. Labor of love.
Well, thank you. I'll settle for that.
No, I quite enjoy it because I find it quite a creative release. So I use pictures and drawings and different cycles and things like that. So when I have a look at it and I think of it from an educational point of view, obviously teachers, and that there's quite a lot of research based on how reflective practice can help in education and how it can work, in those kinds of professions where you can improve your personal practice, but also the method in which you're teaching your students and the outcomes that are expected from them, and teaching them also to reflect on the work that they're doing and, sort of see how they can improve themselves without you needing to point out where they might have improved, for themselves. It's quite difficult actually, because there has to be quite a fine line, because you don't want to be in a position where you're pointing a finger, because reflection has to be a personal thing. It's got to be something that the person's kind of doing themselves, and it can be guided. And I think that's where obviously a teacher or an educator's got quite a balance to, a role to fill, because they've got to have a look at how they can assist their student in doing so without being too directive.
I've always had a major, almost philosophical problem with making an assessment, a judgment, an evaluation of any sort of someone else's learning and insights, because it's so personal, it's so contextual. Who knows better than the person themselves what it is that they're trying to explain?
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think there it makes, especially when you have a look at how marking and that was done, even 10, 20, 30 years ago, there's always no, this is wrong and that is right. And there's no, no possible way that something could be different.
It's disrespectful. It's awful.
Yeah. It makes children feel almost afraid of answering or coming forward with new ideas. So it makes them afraid to say, well, look, I've had a different idea, or I thought, maybe if I conveyed my thoughts this way, it might be better. you know, but it's sort of very regimental before. And I think there is a good thing there, that education is kind of changing that way, where you can see where students are asked to look at their work, to self-mark as well, to reflect on it and explain themselves a bit more, and to give reasons why they've taken certain actions. And I think that's quite important. And
I agree. I like it when learners are a partner in a process rather than the recipients of the wisdom of others.
Yes, and it makes them more receptive. I've seen this in conversation with students, that they're more receptive to learning when they've taken the decision to do so themselves, rather than being forced or told to do so. And I think this is especially true of teenagers. You know, they've already got all these things going on. They don't still want their teachers and everyone else telling them exactly what they should be thinking and learning, you know.
I think that this is what we're talking about, because the more we reflect critically, the more we gain insights, the more we form opinions. And if those opinions are not respected and not actually even taken into account during a so-called assessment process, for instance, and it doesn't have to be in a formal assessment, but essentially if we don't respect others' reflection on their own experience, I think that's deeply disrespectful.
Yeah, because you need to understand things from other people's paradigms, and this is, again, it's like each person is going to experience the same event completely differently.
Definitely.
It depends on their past experiences, their own opinions, their own feelings, and that inner person's voice is really where the critical side of that reflective practice comes in, because you're not dealing just with a superficial sort of, you know, the outward part of what's going on. You're actually looking very much internally, and that then becomes a crucial role in that person's process of learning or development.
Crikey, some big stuff here, Lauren. I'm immediately thinking that the conditioning is not just on the part of the learner, but also on the supply side of learning rather than demand side. A lot of so-called facilitators are still instructors. They still feel there's one best way to do things, typically their way, or the way that, for instance, an accredited framework says should be. And I think to move out of the conditioning of I am the expert, you're told things, into a genuine partnership facilitative role of what's your views on this? What does this mean to you? What's going on here for you? And genuinely, absolutely taking account of individual reflections. That's a hard thing for a facilitator to do. Absolutely.
I think a facilitator, and this is where coaching is such a wonderful facilitation process, because if it's done right, it isn't a telling of doing things. It's not directive at all. It's very much a non-directive approach. Agreed. Where you can ask deep, open questions for your client or your customer or your student to think and ponder over and reflect on, and then come back with their response and the thing. And you can obviously build on that relationship from there. I do feel, and as it's very much a two-way street, and there's as much for the facilitator to learn as there is for the person who's actually doing the reflection.
I think more, because the facilitator will be felt by the learner. I call people learners. We're all learners. I'm a learner. Everyone is. But I think the learner will very often defer to a facilitator because of this conditioned space they're in of coming through an educational system in this country, no doubt similar to others that you might be more familiar with from an early age, where they're basically conditioned to expect, like I said before, the wisdom of others. And the facilitator's got to gently ease them out of that space sometimes in order to encourage them to reflect, encourage them to think more critically, and to respect, in turn, those reflections that emerge.
Well, I mean, it's a complete change of methodology almost, because education in the past was very rote and almost, I want to say, a one mold fits all approach.
Yes.
And it's very difficult because, as you say, we're not all the same. We all have our own objectives. We've all got our own perceptions and experiences, and everybody experiences the world in their own unique way. And I think that is something where facilitator, teacher, educator, coach has to be quite skillful in understanding that perception and being able to see it from the other person's point of view, as well as being fully aware of their own. And I think that's where, when you're thinking about critical reflection, and how that practice is being developed within an individual, if you're a coach, you might be able to do that with practice while sessions are ongoing, and you might be able to say, oh, well, this is working quite well, perhaps we can lean more into that, or perhaps this is not working so well, I need to change my approach here. This could, and that's only something that somebody who's quite experienced can do. You know, for a lot of people, they're not very aware of their actions and how to change them, and to be able to make that shift from what they might be used to, as you said, that guided process.
Yeah.
They've kind of been told, well, you have to think this way, you have to do it this way, this is the only right way to do it. And to change that shift of going, well, actually, if I think of doing it differently, how might I, or how would I like to do it, or how might I have, you know, adapted to a situation differently just because I've been able to have the freedom to do so. And that's where the questioning techniques, listening skills and things like that come in for a coach. And it's something that needs to be developed, really. It's not something that you're just going to wake up one day and go, oh, I'm really good at this. You do need to practice it. And it is a conscious and active, you know, thing that you do. It's not something that you just sort of on a whim.
No, I mean, I won't dispute any of that. You're really singing my song. And I think we make it perhaps sound like a more straightforward process than a lot of people would believe it to be. I think much as we would like more people to take that role as a facilitator of others' learning, some people would dismiss it as just airy-fairy conceptual stuff. Some people would say, well, I've done all right up to now. I've had all these great results. Why should I change what I do? There is resistance to taking a, what I'll again say, respectful view. There is resistance to being anything other than an instructor for a lot of people in that helping to learn role. And so I'm going to throw in here now, we're talking quite, in my view, properly about recognizing the individual specific and different, unique, in fact, circumstances and context of a learner. One of the problems with the current British, certainly political fixation with apprenticeships and framework-based qualifications is we're going back to a 1980s and 90s competency framework whereby you must assess people in their ability to do these benchmarked behavioral things. And that restricts, although it doesn't have to entirely, but it can restrict the mindset of people to say, well, here you are, just proving do this, instead of being able to range as broadly and to have the freedom to work with people outside of such a framework.
Yeah, I think with frameworks and that, it does make things very prescriptive. It does provide, I mean, there's an argument for and against it. You know, it's like with professionalization of industries and things like that, there obviously is an argument for it in the sense that it gives people a higher standard to attain. You know, it makes everyone
consistency.
Yes, you know, you get that run through the whole industry and you know what you can expect based on the qualification level and things like that. But then, as you say, on the flip side of that, it also sort of almost stagnates certain industries in a way, because it means that person can only go so far before they've outgrown that particular point. And then if they want to change that, it could be quite difficult. You know, and that's the difficulty with frameworks and things, especially in education. Those wheels turn very, very slowly.
True.
You know, especially because of the size of the organizations and things like that. If you look at any organization, whether it's the NHS or the education departments or schools, you know, government-based departments and things like that, the wheels, they do turn, but they might take 30 years to turn.
Yeah, and I think, we ought not to dismiss the let's think the right word here, the opportunity, the options here, because I've just written a note here, is that even with a prescriptive structured framework to apply, I mean, crikey, you're talking about completing a dissertation for a qualification out of a very reputable organization that I know very well, and you need a structure. You can't just take people onto a program like you've been engaged in and before and just say randomly go out there and learn things, that'll be all right. People need a framework. They need a degree of structure. And I think the problem for me is people in a facilitative role and in an assessment process where appropriate don't think sufficiently creatively or innovatively, because even in a prescriptive, you must show your ability to do this, how we go about that has got a lot of scope. The very fact that we're doing this is a method I've used in an as an assessment methodology. It doesn't have to be, give me 3 things you can prove you can do it that I can see on a piece of paper. It could be an interaction like this that more effectively, more interactively delves and explores a competency than anything you can write on a piece of paper, which is not interactive.
That's true. I think a lot of it becomes outcome focused.
Yes.
And that's the difficulty, because there's not necessarily the process that's involved. So that's again, it comes back to the learner's experience and their viewpoint of things, because if it's only outcome focused,
yes,
they're not bothered with how they got to that point, whether they've actually been able to do the task or not do the task.
Yeah.
Just, okay, they've made it, they've done it, it's okay, they can move on.
That is so true, because a lot of assessors, if we can call them that, would say, yeah, okay, I don't need to know any more than that. You've proved to me you can do it. But I want to tell you about how it was for me. I want to tell you about what I thought about it. No, we don't need that. And that's such a shame.
It's a very blanket approach, you see, and this is the difficulty, because for me personally, I'd say the process is very important, because that also establishes the precedent by which that person's going to interact in their career or chosen path, whether they understand the processes, whether they understand the way of, you know, managing certain situations and how they manage to deal with things. Whereas if it's just an outcome driven issue, they could handle one situation well and be given the, okay, well, there you go, you've done it, off you go.
Yes, absolutely.
Versus, you know, maybe trying 10 different ways or approaches, you know, and that's where the reflection comes in, because reflection is not just an outcome.
Absolutely.
It's not outcomes based at all. It's process driven, because you go through that stage of sifting and filtering through your thoughts and processes, which then helps you to come to your own natural conclusion or outcome.
Well, I agree with you. And I just got a horrible feeling that a lot of people who are purely outcome and evidence-based would be thinking to themselves, oh, for goodness sake, I don't need all this. All I need is the evidence that you can do this and this and we can move on. Why are you telling me all this stuff about how deeply you thought about it and what insights you've had? I don't need that stuff. And I think people do think that way. And it's such a hard mindset to move. Lauren, I'd like to take us back to something that I've noted a bit earlier. When we kicked off this conversation, pretty much we talked about ways in which we can critically reflect. And I think the thing to emphasize here is critical reflection is deeper than fleeting thoughts that we forget 3 minutes later. And you mentioned journaling. I'm also a journaler. And but I'm also interested to explore other means, other processes by which we can thoroughly, effectively reflect critically, such as, I think, this that we're doing now. I think there is a lot of value in critical reflection interactively, to explore interactively, to articulate and to access explicitly thoughts that you've got in conversation with someone else.
Well, I think that's quite an important thing that you're pointing out, because obviously that brings in the issue of supervision.
It does.
And there again, we've had some interesting conversations with some of my colleagues about this, because supervision, in my personal opinion, is an essential or critical part of coaching. It's something that helps the coach to be able to go through that critical conversation with someone else in a safe space and environment, and to offload, if you will. And a lot of coaches don't see the benefit of supervision yet, because it's not something that's promoted or widely encouraged, based on cost in some cases. That
definitely.
Involved, but also for the value, because not all coaches see the value in having that conversation and sort of having the, I would say, outsider's viewpoints on possibly issues that are happening internally, because a lot of coaches work independently. So you're a one-man show, you work by yourself, or you work on your own in your departments. And you might be, implementing this culture that you want to get into your organization, but you might be the only person who's got experience in that, or who's got any coaching qualifications, or, things like that. And that then makes it quite difficult for you to go and have a conversation with someone else in your organization, because they wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about or what you're wanting to implement. So there again, if you want to have that conversation and you sort of want to use the tools and frameworks and that for reflection, you need to be able to have that conversation with an outside person. And I think that does make sense to me, because I've got another colleague that I do it with quite frequently. And sometimes you might need to do it more frequently, depending on what coaching action you're taking at the time, whether you're coaching, what type of coaching you're doing. You might feel that there's more of an emotional need. Sometimes if you're involved in more emotional coaching, systems and things like that, you might feel like you need to offload a little bit more and to have deeper conversations relating to your practice.
Yeah, I agree, and I've certainly found supervision does that for me. It might be something we can explore in its own right. I certainly think that critical reflection, either in the context of supervision or indeed conversations such as this, purposeful, clear, driven by specific thoughts, if you like. You know, we were clear about what we were going to talk about here. I've started to realize through a series of events such as this, of recorded conversations like this, that critical reflection is massively enhanced by the ability to access and articulate your own thoughts.
Yes. Or you're putting into words what might be floating around in your mind. So you're hearing it out loud. And I've often said to students, you know, when you're busy learning, you need to reteach yourself. And the way you do that is by putting your thoughts into words, and you put them on paper and you say them out loud, because then you reformulate them, you rehear them for yourself.
Yes.
And that sometimes helps you to sort of categorize them and sort of build a better picture of what you're trying to achieve. And just that process itself helps you to then move forward into what the next section of what you might want to achieve is. Because it is a self-motivated or self-driven process.
Yes, it is.
Tell you, okay, well, you need to go and be critically reflective. You might go, well, sure, whatever, and go on. You know? It's not, somebody might say, well, you have to do this as part of your job, and you might be like, well, why? You know, so it's something that is self-motivated. You must want to do that, and you must want to participate in it, because otherwise it's not going to be critical. It will be fleeting, if you will. And you need to have also some sort of focus. And that focus, that conversation, like what we're having now, it gives you focus, because the other person might ask you a question and you might think, oh, well, yes, actually, I've been sort of mulling around with that idea, but I've not really articulated it, or I've not really developed that thought much further. And by having that conversation, you're then developing those thoughts and sort of putting it more into action, rather than just sort of thinking about it vaguely.
Yeah, absolutely. Craigie, you know, this is going to be a totally cozy conversation, because there's nothing that I could possibly pick fault with there, nor am I trying to. I've just written another note here. I have to write things down or I forget about them. And the note I've made here is not valued. I think being pragmatic, being realistic, we both know, and we both feel, and we both have experienced through our own practice, the value of critical reflection, of going beyond, as you've just said, the fleeting thoughts into some articulation in writing, interactively. We both know the value of that. I feel, to generalize, the workplace, whatever that means to people, does not value that. The workplace values activity over productivity, and to see someone at a workplace with maybe their eyes shut, critically reflecting, thinking deliberately about how something can be done better, rather than just rushing around doing things, is not valued. I don't think organizational practice in enough places encourages critical reflection.
I think it comes back to the conversation that people have about being effective versus being efficient. You've got that, like, you've got some people who are very efficient or very good at looking very busy, and they're always kind of running around doing lots of things that actually never ever really get anything done. And I think the challenge there in a workplace is that to create that value, because obviously with big organizations, and in education especially, there's a lot of KPIs that are outcomes based.
There are.
And it makes it quite a challenge, because I mean, in conversation with teachers, they're always looking at, well, you know, my students need to pass. Their results are at, you know, their bonuses, everything gets based on how many students pass, how well they do. You know, those are, you know, promotions, all those things get linked to those specific outcomes. The challenge there is that to improve your own practice and to improve your ability to have those outcomes and to achieve those outcomes or those KPIs, you need to be able to improve your practice, and you need to be able to get those results from your students or your learners or your co-workers.
Sure.
And you can't do that unless you take time out to develop and think about your own processes, because you might be a completely ineffective manager. You know, you might not be communicating properly to your staff. You know, those are all things that are important. So you might be getting the task done, but the method in which you're using might, you know, equate into high staff turnovers, or, you know, a lot of, I don't know, disgruntled staff issues, you know, problems within learning environments, maybe, you know, one can think in terms of student behavior. All those things come into play when it comes to people only being outcome driven.
Well, I think so. And I'm thinking to myself as I hear you say this, I have never, ever encountered in 28 years of working for myself, in 38 years of being in the learning industry, I have never, ever in so many organizations I've worked in of any sort, ever come across an operational line manager who has encouraged any of his people to reflect more, to spend more time consciously, critically reflecting on practice. No, they just want people to rush around, get the job done, and achieve short-term goals.
Yeah, and that is exactly what it is. It's a short-term goal. It's not looking at the big picture. And I've seen this with students. You know, when in Botswana, I had a very powerful program that we were running with students there, especially doing their GCSEs and A-level programs. Mm-hmm. And in this exact situation, we had conversations with teachers going, no, the student is failing, they're not getting it done, they're lazy. You know, they're at school now. Bear in mind that here in the UK, school is from 9 to 3 essentially. Mm-hmm. And some schools might include a prep session, which is maybe 9 to 4. In South Africa and Botswana, school starts at 7:15 in the morning. And the majority of students are fortunate if they get home by 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's a full day at school. And their learning environment is very different to here. It's a lot stricter. And especially in Botswana, they still have corporal punishment and things like that. So it's a very different environment to here. So students there are tired when they get home, they're exhausted, they've still got homework to do and all those things. So when they get home in the evening, they still have maybe 2 or 3 hours worth of work to do. And then they go back to school tired the next morning. So the teachers are like, oh, this child is lazy, they're always sleepy, and they're having all these complaints, but those kids are being driven to the ground basically with their educational outcomes. And with the program that I was running, we used to have certain incentives for students to help them to be able to take time out and say, well, you know, what is an activity that you enjoy? Perhaps it's art or, you know, football, whatever. What's that activity? And how can we relate that activity to your educational outcomes? In other words, you know, how can we link the two so that you can make, you know, the task that you have to do more enjoyable? And a lot of those students with that, their critical reflection comes in because they've got to think about things that they like, what they enjoy, how it can, you know, link back to something that they want to do, which is the outcome they want is they want to get an A star for their GCSE. The question... And
was the suspicion, Lauren, was the suspicion about motive? Are they serious about this? Because as you say, this is a very, I'm getting the impression of a authoritarian, deferential environment. To be asked to take responsibility, to be asked to become a respected partner in the process, if you like, was a suspicion about that? Is this really going on?
Yeah, well, the incentive for the students is that the Botswana government funds all the university studies, which they then don't need to pay back if they attain a certain, so they can get full scholarship or full sponsorship for their higher education.
Okay.
So that's where the thing comes in, because, you know, with some students, they could get international scholarships. And I've got several students who've gone and studied internationally, and some of them in China, some of them in America at Stanford.
Right.
And things like that. So very well educated, and they had the opportunities that are available to them if they are high achievers. The challenge is obviously to get to the point where they want to be the high achiever, despite the circumstances and the environment. So you've got the outcome versus the process. So our situation was to try and help those students to follow a process that's going to help them to do something consistently that will give them the outcome. So that reflection, taking time out of their day to go and sit and do revision for an hour, was important, even though they knew full well that the next day they still have got 2 hours worth of homework. To be able to say to a student, look, you've got to buy out an hour every day to do X, Y, Z, or half an hour every day, and I guarantee you, you're going to get this result. And those students who do it had the results. They got the 6A stars.
Right.
So it's to show the importance of where that value lies. It's to create that value, because you need to show that the outcome can be attained, but you need to change the process.
Yeah,
and that's buying out of time. It's very challenging.
Sorry, this is interesting, because I've not got your Botswana experience. I've spent my whole working life embedded in British operational practice, and the parallels are obvious. You've got to make a big effort to create the space for critical reflection. You've got to have a belief that it's going to lead to better outcomes, whether they're educational outcomes in Botswana or operational outcomes in British industry. That is a leap of faith for a lot of people in this country, I would say, operationally, in terms of how things are done, because they bumbled along up to now and got away with, I think, the sort of outcomes that could have been enhanced by a lot more thought, a lot more critical reflection, a lot more, for instance, comfort with how the hell did we foul this up? Let's not do it again, instead of, oh, we don't want to talk about that. No one's asking us to.
Brush that under the carpet quietly. Oh, nobody saw that. Let's just brush it away quickly.
Exactly. And I can understand that. That's absolutely... it's not incomprehensible. It's the ways things are done. And unless people are required to think about things they don't want to think about, they won't go there and do that, because A, they've got plenty to do already, and B, it hurts. I mean, there's something else that I'm thinking about here, Lauren, and I didn't know what I'd be thinking about until we started this conversation. And I just wanted to raise the issue of personality type, because
oh, yes.
I wonder if people would think there's a personality type which is more suited, more comfortable with critical reflection. I've got a feeling that that's the case, and that it's more of an effort for people like me, the interrupters, the extroverts, the people who like to hear the sound of their own voice. And that is how many people do I come across when I show my learning log to and say, I do this? They say, oh, I'm not that sort of person. I say, well, nor am I, because I am a non-diary keeping talker, not a listener, and not a writer-downer. I force myself to do what isn't natural. And I just got a feeling that there is a perception that certain personality types are more suited somehow to critical reflection than others.
Well, it's that openness, isn't it? And that's where that psychometric testing and things comes into it, because it gives a person the opportunity to sometimes acknowledge their shortcomings and their own faults, if you will.
Oh, you're too harsh. You come from a part of the world that actually talks the way it is. We hide behind things like areas of potential development. We don't use the word weakness. We say strengths yet to develop. But you're blunt. Things that people are, yeah, I'm all for that.
We say it like it is. It's true. I've had to, since I've been here, and it's now in November, it will be 7 years. I've had to change my language, the way I use language. I've had to become very polished and not be blunt and to the point sometimes, because I can offend people that way.
We had this wonderful term called not yet competent to describe people who basically aren't meeting certain standards. And let me take this back, because what's your view on personality type, or the perception, if not the reality, of personality type in respect of critical reflection?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think it's a perception. There is a very definite link. I personally feel there is, because some people are more open to change than others. And again, that comes back to, as you say, their personality type, their perceptions, their paradigms of the world that they've been exposed to, and the environments that they've been exposed to. I think here in Britain, people, some people are very set in their ways, and that change management is a painful process. It's something that they don't like to do, especially in older organizations. To make changes is quite a challenge, especially when it's older management and things like that, because they're like, well, this has worked for 30 years. We get 7.5% increase on turnover every year, and we're very happy with that. But what they've not realized is that perhaps if they had a look at implementing things differently and taking that change, they could have a 30% increase every year.
It's what I call acceptable underperformance, putting up with something which could be a lot better, but isn't worth the effort.
Yeah, exactly. So with personalities, and I had a psychometric test a few years ago, and it's really very informative, because what it does is it tells you what you already know, but
it does.
on paper. It tells you what you know, but you're actually seeing it from, like, on paper. This is actually who I am, what I do, the way I do things, and the reason why I do things in a certain way. And when you look at that, and you look at the way you practice and the way you experience things, it also can help you to manage yourself and your processes a lot better. So like your reflective practice, if you're looking at a psychometric test and you say, oh, well, I'm actually quite an extroverted person, I'm quite bold, and I don't like people telling me the way it is. You might go, well, actually, if I'm going to change, I need to be able to tone myself down so I can hear the other person's perspective, or, you know, be open to change, or be open to new opportunities, because I'm willing to listen instead of just conveying my own thoughts and feelings all the time.
So pushing you on this, do you feel that more introspective people are more natural critical reflectors? I don't know.
It's possible. And I'll say this in terms of depending on how the person takes critique or criticism in general. And I'll say this because I'll look at my two children, and I'm grateful they're not here, so they won't hear this. I've got an introvert and an extrovert in my house, and both my children are quite deep thinkers.
Right.
They're deep thinkers in different ways. So my daughter, for example, she will experience something that she might have liked or not liked, and I'm never quite sure how she's taken it, because she's quite quiet about it.
And she doesn't tell you what her
thought processes
are.
She'll come and talk to me about it later, but she internalizes that entire reflective process, thinks about it, those cogs are turning, she'll go over it, and she'll come back and she'll say, oh, you know, Mom, I didn't really like XYZ, or, oh, you know, I absolutely loved this and I really want to do it again. And it would surprise me, because I wouldn't have thought that was it. For example, she has an absolute passion for drama. She loves it, and when she's on the stage, she's a completely different person. But when you meet her, everyone's like, oh, she's so shy and she's so quiet.
Well, there's so many examples of that. Hendrix comes to mind immediately. There's so many extrovert performers on a stage that are just not like that anywhere else.
Precisely. Whereas my son is a complete extrovert. He can walk up to anybody, talk to them, and make them his friend within half an hour. They'll be best friends. And he vocalizes his thought processes. So sometimes he'll say something and think, oh, actually, I shouldn't have said that. Let's retrace that a little bit and think about it again. So he's more active. So his reflective process happens in the moment, if you will.
Yeah, and the reason I'm interested in this very issue is, I guess, partly through I'm following my own interests. I've been reading a fair bit and watching a fair bit of Susan Cain, Quiet Power, introspection stuff, Kate Webster. Only this week I came across the work of Elaine Aron, who talks about sensitivity in the workplace. And a Harvard Business Review article I read this week was all about how, in a team leading sense, a lot of team leaders don't allow the space for the more introverted people, don't allow the space in group discussions for the more analytical thinking, quieter people whose views and whose better, stronger views than the shouters are often not heard unless you invite them.
I would tend to agree with that, because it's very much the same with students in a classroom. Where you always you've got the squeaky wheels, which are always active and busy, and miss. You know, and then you've got like those quiet ones that in the corner that are just cracking on, they get the job done, and they're doing well, but they're not actively participating, they're not putting their hand up, they're not stepping forward because they don't want to be shouted down by somebody else.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, and again, your perspective's slightly different to mine, and your history is slightly different to mine. From my operational line management perspective, I think people who manage others should be a lot more insightful in terms of the value of the quiet people and the contribution they can make if handled the right way. What you don't do is say, hey, you quiet person, what do you think about this?
Exactly. You'll send them straight into a panic.
But what you do is you find a way, maybe in advance, to say, look, I really value what your contribution is, and I reckon I don't get enough from you because I don't yet know the best way to get your critical thinking contributing to the decisions being taken in this meeting, because I reckon you go away with a lot of thoughts I'd like to have known about. I don't think that happens very much.
No, I don't think it does, because those conversations, like you say, it's the time and the management of those conversations that's quite important, because staff meetings is probably the worst place to try and get because people don't want to be judged by their thoughts and feelings, and it's always the people that are already loud that are okay with sharing their thoughts and feelings because everybody already knows what they are. They're vocal about them. But then people who are not vocally very expressive would sort of restrain themselves, and they wouldn't have their contribution, even though they would probably have a very valuable contribution to make.
And they are the critical reflectors. They are reflecting deeply. Whilst the shouting people are getting all excited about the importance of what they're saying, the thinking people are recognizing the flaws in that. They're thinking through things. They're seeing what could work, what couldn't. But those critical reflections are missed and are not used to inform decisions that would be better if they were managed in a more effective manner.
Well, they're observers. They observe the situation, and then they analyze it, and then they come to a conclusion. The skill there for a manager is to be able to have a meeting with a person like that and say, well, look, I'd really like your thoughts on this is the agenda for Friday's meeting or Monday's meeting. Could you give me some thoughts or what you'd like to share with the group? And then the manager could share those thoughts.
Absolutely.
Or let the person prepare in advance rather than giving them something spontaneously on the spot.
I think we're describing a sophistication of management that I've seen very little of since 1982.
No, you see, it comes to a manager that's aware, and that I would say critically aware of his staff, their personality types, and also critically aware of his or her own management styles. Because there are different types of managers. There's no doubt about that. You've got those autocratic ones. You've got the ones that are very democratic. You've got those like casual freelancer types. It's different in every organization. And
how many organizations have I worked in where I either hear or I see the thinking going on, if you like? Managers would, I might say, tell me about your team. And they'll say, well, so-and-so and so-and-so's always up there with thoughts and ideas, always driving things along. I don't, then I got some quiet people, and it's almost like the quiet people are written off as non-contributors.
They do. That's exactly what it is, because they're like, oh, well, that person's a complete waste of time because they're not helping out, or they're not vocal about their thoughts. And you kind of think, well, who's doing, most of the work, or who's getting things done? Who's most up to date, who actually manages to go home on a Friday afternoon, on time, rather than grinding it out late in the afternoon, It's usually the people who have that quiet sort of resourcefulness that just kind of chip away at what they're doing.
I've changed my whole mindset on this, because I ought to have been saying to those managers in that situation, so by what means do you draw the value of your quiet people out in meetings? Do you only listen to the shouters? Do you think your quiet people could be encouraged to actually contribute in such a way that makes your collective decisions more effectively? No, they just think quiet people are passive people, are almost, I don't know, what am I trying to say here, are almost opting out, when really they're doing all the thinking the talking people aren't doing.
I think that would be the correct assumption, because it's 100% true, because it starts very early on, and through the education process you can see that in classroom management. You've got to have a look and see how students are performing, but also how they're contributing to lessons and how they express themselves. And they're giving them the confidence to be able to do that. So I'd say if you're going to have people who are naturally more introverted from a young age, it's almost like from school age, teachers have to start being more aware of saying, okay, well, look, I've got to have a look at my entire classroom and see how I can manage them to be able to get a valid or valuable contribution from every single member. And that, in classroom management with 30 people, is not a joke. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Well, I think you're right, because the formative years in which later life mature adults are conditioned, whether it's in the home, where they might be one of 6 in a family, and again, the default position is the shouters are in control, or at school. It's a very hard thing then to change your practice, to draw things out of your personality, to value things in the workplace, particularly in the early years when you're not established, that have not been valued anywhere up to then.
Well, you see, this is where you have to change your management style, and you have to change that perception. And the only way that can happen is, again, coming back to that critical reflective practice, looking at how am I as an individual, what are my personal preferences, and who do I naturally lean towards? Because there are, in any environment, there are going to be certain personality types that naturally have a leaning or inclination to work better together. But for you as a manager or as a teacher, an educator or a coach, you need to be aware of your own personality issues and how you deal with things and how you revise and evaluate, to be able to see how you can be more inclusive and see
during this conversation, I'm becoming more and more aware that so much responsibility lies in the insights and the abilities of a line manager, if I'm thinking in an organizational context, that the responsibility lies there to draw out from the critical reflectors what they themselves will not otherwise bring forward.
That's true. And you know, the other thing is if you're looking at that type of practice, if you're just talking about an organization, looking at line managers and team leaders, your middle managements are the ones who will be dealing more with this than your upper higher managements. And that there, if you're looking at middle management, there's usually a little bit of a gap as far as that CPD, experience, training, and that sort of, those processes are concerned, because middle management is often overloaded with workload because they've usually got quite large teams that they've got to look after. They've got a lot of responsibilities. And for them, it's usually about putting out fires. So by the time they get to the upper management, those fires and everything's being controlled, but there's a whole team below them that sort of maybe, I don't know, vying for information, you know, for getting tasks done, having input, having feedback, being valued as a member of a team, and having that time. It's again coming back to time, cutting out blocks of time for them to be able to evaluate and manage and reflect on how they're performing their tasks. You know, so it becomes quite a struggle, and that segment is often neglected in an organization.
Yeah, and that's you're leading me. Come on, voice. You're leading me to think that the higher up an organization hierarchically and structurally you go, I've got no evidence for this, it's intuitive, I'd like to study it. I get a feeling that the higher up you go hierarchically, the less critical reflectors you see, the more shouters, the more extroverts you see, and consequently the most appalling corporate decisions tend to be made, because boardrooms are absolutely dominated by the extroverted, short-term thinking people that form a culture of that's how we do things around here. We don't value critical reflection. And if we valued critical reflection, we might not have done that ridiculous decision that's cost us £18 million or billions these days. Maybe at the most senior positions in organizations that truly drive strategy, we need more critical reflection. We've got a long way to go to get to that point.
Oh, yeah. There's no doubt. If you think in terms of big, massive organizations and you're looking at their boardrooms, it's very much based on outcome. They're looking at share prices, they're looking at what bonuses are going to be paid out, that they're looking at the drivers and the outcomes. And yes, that question might be posed, oh, well, why did we make that mistake? And that will come back down the line to an upper management. And they'll be like, oh, well, we've been told that it's X, Y, Z reason. And then the person who's going to get the hammering is that middle manager.
Yeah.
But he's not been able to have the time or been afforded the time to deal with his team and to give them time to be able to go, well, actually, if we did this process differently, or we did this more effectively, we could actually work better as a team. Or if we communicate more effectively, we might be able to have a better buy-in from all staff members. You know, those are all things that happen at lower management level, which is completely overlooked when they get to the boardroom.
Yeah, I think there's a widespread and endemic lack of appreciation of the value of the critical reflectors. And I think that's very clearly seen at a senior level. So Lauren, let's come to our closing summary, if you like. For me, the most important issue that's come out of this conversation that I certainly wouldn't have thought about in such clarity before is the responsibility and the significance of drawing the contribution of critical reflectors throughout an organization, and how that is a particular skill of facilitation in line managers that I've really seen.
And I think it's important for people to understand that critical reflection or critical reflective practice is something that has got a high value, and if it's done properly or correctly, if you will, and that correct method of doing it, for example, would be different based on different personality types, different situations, different management skills, levels of management and things like that. And I think that responsibility does come back to the organization and the culture that the organization is trying to create, sure, regardless of whether it's an educational organization or, a corporation or whatever industry they're in. It would really depend very much on how that culture is being developed within the organization, and having those conversations with staff members. That responsibility falls on the management side, on their leadership, to be able to have those conversations and to encourage all staff members to be able to have an opportunity to reflect on their own practice or their own job or their own position, and how they can improve their skill set and what they would need to be able to do that. And again, one doesn't want to go like off on a tangent, but you do want to be able to say, well, if I've made time for this, what's the payoff going to be? How am I going to see the payoff? And the payoff might be in better communication within the organization, a better team spirit. It might be more open. You might have people who are more willing to change or open to change.
Better decisions.
Yeah. Their skills, and they'd be able to upskill themselves and to reflect on their own practice, because they start looking at what skills they might be lacking. So if you give a staff member the opportunity to have a look and say, well, actually, I'm quite an introverted person, so I might lack certain communication skills that I really do need to work on and develop so that I can have my thoughts and feelings heard through the organization in a staff meeting. That could only happen if a manager had that conversation with that person, because that person might just never step forward on their own.
I think so, and I think we'll close it there, only because we've got other things to do today, because this is something we could both explore forever, and and there's more to be got here. Thank you for that, Lauren. I really appreciate your insights. I found that personally very developmental myself. So many thanks for your time.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's been a really good morning. Thank you.